She stood beneath the wooden awning, mud clinging to her skirt, silent as if waiting for permission to go on living. The desert wind shrieked past. An old man with silver hair set a bowl of soup on the sill, his eyes sweeping the dark. No one knocked, but tonight the echo of hoofbeats trembled faintly in the distance. He ladled more water into the pot, his hand unsteady. A small spoon lay on the table, just one, but enough perhaps to change a life. This was not a tale of miracles, only of small acts, just enough to keep one soul tethered to another. And sometimes the placing of a single spoon can turn the course of a life. At the end of a dust-red road split into gravel in West Texas, around the year 1892 stood a gray timber house, nestled into a low slope, its back turned to the mountains. The shingles sagged. A stone hearth breathed thin smoke each dawn and dusk. The porch planks were dry and splintered like the bones of a dead horse left too long in the sun. A small bell hung beneath the crossbeam. It hadn't rung in years. No one came any more, not since Silas Granger's wife passed. Silas lived alone among things no longer mended. He wasn't old enough to be bent with age, but his shoulders had slouched as though his coat no longer fit. Hair the color of ash, beard grayed and uneven, eyes quiet. His days were simple: light the fire, feed the horse, and wait for the light to shift color across the field of dead cactus by the barren Pecos plain. Each evening after washing the pot, he would ladle one extra scoop of soup, though no one ever sat across from him. A chipped porcelain bowl was placed on the windowsill beside a weather-worn frame of rotting wood. Flies came sometimes. The wind would dust its surface with sand. Still, he placed it without fail. Not because he expected anyone to eat, but because, if ever someone needed it, the first thing they'd see would be kindness. He no longer spoke to anyone in the town of Dry Fork. He didn't attend church, not since the land agents came and took the patch of garden his wife once loved. Citing forged deeds he couldn't fight in court. Clara had planted vegetables in that corner of the yard. Now only weeds grew across the bricks she'd once laid in tidy rows. Silas never gave up the land, though they once brought guns to make him. One evening, with the sky like ash and the wind slicing through cracked earth, he looked out toward the place where the road from town met his trail. There was a faint plume of dust. No wagon, no figure, just dust. Still he stood for a long while, as if willing it to gather itself into the shape of someone. But nothing came. He turned back inside, reheated the thin soup with splinters of kindling, poured water from the stone jar, set out 2 bowls as always, one for himself, and one for someone unnamed, silently, like a ritual to keep goodness from decaying, like holding on to a promise whose words had faded, but not the memory of making it. From things unseen, something may begin, a story of a man who thought his living was done, and a girl who believed she was no more than rags, yet was invited to eat from a clean bowl. That story does not begin here, but it will. The dry season stretched a month and a half too long. The creek to the north, where there was usually a trickle left through May, had turned to dust. Each morning Silas checked the traps he'd set for gophers, sometimes pausing longer than needed beneath a split oak tree, watching to see if the leaves fell from wind or from something else. He climbed onto the cattle shed roof that day because a loose board had creaked through the night. Up high the wind hit harder, carrying the scent of burnt grass and horsehide. Something in the air tightened his chest, like the smell of something coming, though it hadn't yet taken shape or name. After lunch, he decided to ride into town for a new spool of barbed wire and a sack of mineral salt for the horse. His mare, Lottie, moved sluggishly, as though she didn't care much for the journey either, but she went. The old cacti along the trail rattled as they passed, dry and brittle like a cough that wouldn't end. The town wasn't much, but it had what was needed: a general store, a gas pump long since out of order, and a row of wooden awnings where men spat tobacco juice onto the dirt. Silas didn't greet anyone. He tied Lottie to a splintered post and stepped inside the shop. That's when he heard the voice, gravelly and worn like a guitar string frayed to its last fiber. "Last of the lot today, a big one. Hard to break and no takers so far." The auctioneer's voice tangled with the wind and the low chuckle of a few men. Silas meant to turn away. He meant to, but his feet would not move. On a makeshift platform, a girl stood silent. No ropes, no pen, no handler. She simply stood there, tall, with hair the red of clay, eyes fixed on no one, bare feet dug into the ground, as if she meant to root herself in dust. Her dress fell short of her ankles, baggy as a grain sack. The sleeves rolled high, like someone had once tried to mold her into something more palatable for sale. No one bought. They laughed. They said, "That mare's been fed too well. Now she's kicking the stall." They called her too big to be tame. Silas stood off to the side beneath the blacksmith's awning, his hand gripping the brim of his hat. The girl didn't bow her head, but she didn't raise it either. Her jaw held steady, square, stubborn, like someone taught too many times to look down and finally stopped complying. Around her left ankle, a faint purple mark lingered like a whisper. Once chained, the auctioneer scratched his scalp, uneasy. "Take her and go if you want. No guarantees. Broke the gatekeeper's arm last week." No one bid, not a sound, not a coin, only wind and sunlight pouring over her head as if trying to burn away what no one understood. Silas didn't step forward, didn't say a word, but he stayed longer than he meant to, and that evening, when he rode back home under a gray sky with no rain, the wind humming through the holes in his broken roof, he saw fresh, muddy footprints on the porch. Night fell without the sound of crickets. Only wind scraped the dry earth like fingernails against tanned hide. Silas returned home just as the sun sank behind the ridge. His mare, Lottie, was still tied to the fence, her head bowed low over an unfinished bundle of hay, as if listening to what the ground had to say. He removed the saddle, checked the old horse's ankle, then stepped straight into the kitchen. The scent of wood ash, of rusted iron clinging to the cast-iron skillet, same as every day. He lit the fire, poured water into the pot, dropped in thin sliced potatoes and the dried pork bone he'd soaked since morning. Every movement slow, not because anyone was waiting, not because anyone might come late. As he cupped his hand around the stove flame, a sound broke the stillness. Faint, a hoofbeat? No, fabric brushing wood. Something had stirred just beyond the porch, where darkness gathered and the lantern light hadn't reached. Silas stood, took the lantern, and opened the door. There she was, the girl left behind, the girl no one bought, the girl too big to be tame. In the dim light, red dust clung in streaks to her skirt. Her hair was a snarl of straw, her cheeks smudged with soot. She didn't look hungry, not exactly. She looked spent, like someone who had already given up everything she could possibly lose. She didn't speak, didn't raise a hand, didn't take a step back. She only stood, as if the porch wasn't a threshold to be asked to cross, but the last place a person could stand without becoming lost altogether. Silas looked down. Her bare feet were broad, thick-veined, but the big toe on her left foot was cracked, bleeding. Near the door, a muddy print still glistened, fresh, dark, pressed deep. A mark left by someone who had stood too long, unable to move forward. He didn't ask anything. He simply turned back inside, picked up the ladle and scooped more soup, took down a second porcelain bowl, fetched an old towel once used for drying horses. He placed the bowl on the small wooden table without looking at her, set the towel on the bench across from him, precisely 2 paces away, then turned again, took up a spoon, and stirred the bubbling pot. She hadn't stepped in yet, but the sound of boiling water was warm enough to make even a stray cat believe it was welcome, and so the girl no one wanted stepped onto the porch. On feet no one thought knew how to stop walking. The door stayed open, the fire stayed lit, and the soup simmered with a sound like a sentence whispered but not spoken. No need to say a thing. Staying is enough. That night, not much was said. In truth, nothing was said at all. The girl sat at the edge of the long bench, back straight without leaning, her feet drawn close like she feared taking up too much space. Her shoulders were wide, built like a draft horse's bones, but she kept them tucked in, curled like a creature once struck for eating where it shouldn't. The bowl before her remained full. She didn't touch it right away, only breathed in the steam of ginger broth, slow and deep, then sat still. Silas sat across the table, shoulders turned slightly outward, the posture of a man long used to eating alone. He didn't push, didn't stare, just quietly chewed a slice of potato, soft and cooling on the tongue. The little oil lamp in the center cast a warm yellow glow across the wooden ceiling. Her shadow stretched tall on the wall, larger than anything else in that house. But it didn't cover anyone, didn't crowd anything. It simply existed, as if it too was waiting for someone to believe it belonged there. Only after the broth had cooled did she finally lift the spoon. Her hand was thick, sun-darkened, fingers calloused, shaped like whetstone, but they raised the spoon gently. She tasted once, paused, then tasted again. No compliments were given, no one said it was good, but when Silas stood to refill the kettle, he poured into the other bowl too, as he had done for months. Only this time, for the first time, someone drank it dry. The next morning he rose as always, boiled water as always. When he opened the door to the yard, the sun had just crested the eastern trees. Early wind blew through the burlap sacks hanging out to dry. He looked around. She was gone. A small ache pinched his chest, like he'd let himself believe something not meant to be real. That someone who'd been sold, chained, ridiculed, might stay just because of a bowl of soup. He set the kettle on the stove, meaning to ready the saddle for work, when he heard a clatter from the direction of the barn. What stopped him wasn't the sound itself, but the orderliness of it. The cattle barn, whose door had hung loose on broken hinges since last year, had been braced shut with a plank nailed clean across. The nails were fresh. Nails he kept in a metal tin, stowed on the third shelf behind the kitchen. She hadn't asked, but she'd noticed. Didn't know how to knit, but she split wood with the grain. Didn't ask to stay, but she fixed a door like someone not planning to leave. When he returned to the kitchen to ready breakfast, he set out a third bowl. Not the same bowl from the night before, but a small ceramic one, faded blue pattern, chipped along one side. His wife's bowl from when she was still alive. He placed it on the table across from the girl's bench and turned away as if it meant nothing. When he came back with the kettle, the bowl held a small piece of cornbread. No one had put it there, but someone had given up part of their own meal and quietly shared it across the table. 3 bowls, 2 people at the table. And somewhere, between the chipped crockery, the weathered wood, and the wind whispering through the cracks in the old barn roof, something had stopped coming undone. By the third morning, Silas no longer looked around upon waking to make sure she was still there. He already knew. She was here. No need to check. Her presence didn't announce itself in shadows on the porch, or the thud of heavy steps on the wooden floor. It lived in the quiet, steady shifts, inside a house he'd once thought had nothing left to change. The leaking roof above the kitchen, long patched with burlap sacks, had been repaired with a sheet of old tin he vaguely recalled tossing behind the horse shed. The water line, choked with moss and silt, had been cleared without him lifting a finger. The stones blocking the chicken run, stones that had tripped him more than once, were gone. No one had said a word. No one had asked her to do it. She worked like someone who had always lived there, or like someone who had spent a lifetime wishing for a place to stay long enough not to be sent away. Once, Silas came out back and found her burying a dead goat. He didn't ask when it had died. She didn't ask for help. She dug with the rhythm of someone who'd turned more earth than her years should allow. Afterward, she washed her hands in the tin basin, dried them on an old rag, and returned to tending the stove like nothing had happened. Silas didn't thank her. She didn't need him to. That evening, as the sun sank behind the scorched brush, the two of them sat beneath the porch eaves. Neither looked at the other. Each held a tin cup of cool water. Their shadows fell together across the steps, like two people who had wandered far in opposite directions and now, by some mercy, paused at the same resting place. Even the feral cat from the hills, once never seen closer than the fence line, had slipped into the chicken coop and curled up in the old hay corner. Maybe it, too, felt something had softened here. When night came down, Mira walked out into the yard. Silas stood on the porch and watched her step toward the fence, adjusting a tilted post. Not to keep the horse in, not for fear of anything. Only because the post leaned, and leaning things should be set straight. People don't need a reason to do what's right. Only the peace to do it. Silas turned back inside, pulled an old notebook from the drawer and wrote a few lines. Wines returned, barns patched. The girl knows how to measure boards with her eyes, back like a redwood beam, hands thick but never break things, eyes that never beg. He paused, letting the pen hover, then added, "It's been a long time since this house felt lived in." That afternoon, the air grew heavy with the scent of a dust storm rolling in from the Chihuahuan desert. No rain, just wind laced with fine grit, scratching the hardened ground like old claws against cured hide. Silas was mending a saddle in the front shed when he saw Mira sitting beneath the oak tree, one leg drawn in, rubbing something along her foot. She didn't notice him. Not out of rudeness, but because she'd long since learned not to be seen looking too long. She pulled off her boot, shook out a few small stones, flexed her foot. The slanting light caught her hair, and Silas saw it then. The scar circling her left ankle. Bruised, purplish, sunk deep into the flesh, like a memory still etched from the chain once locked there 3 years before when she'd been tied in a labor shed at Mound Creek, worked to exhaustion beneath the summer sun. The metal was gone, but the skin remembered. Silas stood in the shadow of the doorway. His heart skipped, not from curiosity, but from shame. Not for anything he himself had done, but for the weight of all that had been done. And now, here he stood, a man representing a world that had allowed such things to be done. He turned inside, opened the old trunk beneath the kitchen hearth. From it he took out a pair of soft leather shoes, ash brown, low at the ankle. Worn, but still sound. They had once belonged to his wife, worn during winters, the kind of shoes not meant for fleeing, but warm enough to stand long in the yard without going numb. He didn't wrap them, didn't polish, just carried them out, placed them gently on the porch step, and walked away, sitting down as if nothing had happened. Later, when Mira came into the kitchen, her feet were clean. She walked barefoot, silent. Her eyes didn't seek, but they passed over the shoes. She sat across from him at the small table. She didn't ask, "Whose are these?" Didn't say, I can't take them." Didn't refuse with a glance. Didn't thank him aloud. But her hand brushed lightly over the collar of the shoe, testing the softness. like a person learning to trust something they never imagined they might deserve. A pair of shoes not for running, but for standing still. That night, as Silas stepped outside to gather wood, the wind had begun to howl. A sharper whistle, the sign that the dust storm would hit before dawn. Mira stood on the porch, watching the sky, her hand gripping the doorframe, as if ready to brace the wind for the sake of the house. And he heard them, her footsteps behind him, not light, not timid, but clear, even, the steps of someone who had chosen to walk straight across a threshold, without bowing her head. The kitchen roof on the east side had sprung a small leak since last season. When the rains came, water would slip through drop by drop, falling into the old cast-iron skillet with a sound like a ticking clock, counting down. Silas couldn't stand that sound. Each time it echoed through the quiet, it brought back the last nights of his wife's life, the coughs that tore through the dark, while he sat beside her, helpless. It was the same rhythm, the same slow drip that no one could stop. He told himself today was the day. He'd fix it, climb up. This time he didn't tell Mira, not because he thought she couldn't do it, but because something stubborn and bone-deep in a man who's lived alone too long said, "This is still my job." The wooden ladder, one he'd built himself a decade ago, had a rung that had split. He knew that, but this morning he forgot, or chose to forget. He stepped on the 5th rung, heard the creak. By the 8th, the snap came sharp, like something breaking not just in the ladder, but in his chest. Everything blurred after that. Only wind, only dust. He fell. His head struck the edge of the porch. Not enough to knock him out, but enough to ring his skull like a bell. Then he saw her face above him, not sharp, but near. No panic, no shouting, just the shape of her, leaning down. And then he was lifted, not like an old man being caught mid-collapse, but like something important, carried by someone used to bearing weight. Silas didn't resist, didn't feel shame. Only a sharp ache as she settled him onto the long bench. She didn't ask if he was hurt, didn't lift his shirt or poke at bruises, just stoked the fire, boiled water, crushed dry ginger, and poured it into a chipped clay cup. When she handed it to him, her hands were still smudged with ash, but the cup was warm. Her scent filled the room, dry hay, muddy earth, and rain that had just stopped falling. Silas took a sip, then gave a quiet laugh. "Getting old," he said. She sat in the chair across from him, didn't respond, but for the first time her eyes met his. Not with admiration, not seeking recognition, but simply because when two people stand inside the same house, on the same side of the wind, it's only right to look one another in the eye. Silas winced, touched his knee. She stood, opened the cabinet, pulled out an old bandage, dipped it in warm water. Her hands moved like they'd done it before, too many times to count. They didn't tremble, even though people used to say, "Those hands are too big to be gentle." By sundown, the rain had stopped, the fire had gone out, and the broken ladder still lay across the yard. But from that day on, Silas didn't climb alone anymore. Not because he couldn't, but because someone now stood at the foot of the ladder, ready to catch him should he fall. The wind shifted again that Friday morning. Southern gusts swept in red dust from town, thick with the scent of rusted gasoline and old sweat. Silas was spreading mineral salt around the barn when Lottie, the mare, suddenly lifted her head, ears twitching. He looked where she looked. A wagon creaked up the cracked dirt path, its wheels scraping over loose stone. 2 men rode in it, one with slicked-back hair and a wide-brimmed hat, the other in a black vest, eyes small and dry, like shriveled seeds. Neither of them smiled. Silas set down the shovel, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stepped into the open yard. Mira stood just behind the doorway. She didn't move. Her face stayed still, but her fingers whitened where they clenched the doorframe. The older man stepped down from the wagon and strode forward. From inside his coat, he pulled a stack of papers, unfolded them and held them out to Silas like an invoice for dead cattle. "We've got legal documents," he said. "Clearly filed. States this girl's lost property from Mound Creek Reformation Facility. She's not free. She's not permitted outside boundary lines." Red seal, typewritten print, a name, a case number. Silas didn't look at the paper. He looked the man in the eye. "Out here," he said slowly, "no one is property." The man smiled. The kind of smile worn by men used to winning. "You think the law don't reach this far, old man?" The second man laid a hand gently on the grip of his revolver. His gaze swept from Mira to the barn, pricing everything one more time. Silas didn't move, but his hand slid one button open on his shirt, just enough to show a sliver of worn metal hanging from his neck. An old service tag, not a threat, just a reminder. He knew what was worth protecting. The air grew heavy, like rain just before the break. Mira didn't run, didn't hide behind him. She stepped forward just one pace, enough for them to see the scar on her ankle and the way her eyes met theirs. Not with defiance, not with pleading, just steady, unbowed. The man in the vest snorted. "We'll be back with someone higher up." They climbed into the wagon. The wheels ground into the dirt, dust curling up and swallowing the steps. Silas didn't turn back in right away. He stood facing the horizon, then said quiet, like an old vow pulled from the chest, "Not this time. I'm not losing anyone else." Mira didn't answer, but when he stepped back into the house, he saw the old pair of his wife's shoes, freshly wiped clean and dry, set neatly at the door. A silent answer. "I'm not going anywhere." That noon, there was no sun, no rain. The sky wasn't quite gray, more like the color of a worn cowhide. But something in the wind had slowed, a hush that felt like a quiet warning. Mira had driven the goats to the southern field, where the stones were fewer. Silas sat on the porch, a cup of cold tea in his hand, eyes following her but not really seeing. Those men would return, with more papers, with more reasons. He knew it, just as he'd once known he couldn't save his wife, even when he held the forged land documents in his hands, even when he'd driven all the way to the courthouse doors. He'd turned back, not from fear, but because once the one you love is gone, there's no one left to prove anything to. But Mira, the girl, she was still here, still had a stretch of life that hadn't been taken from her yet. Silas stood, went back inside. It had been a long time since he'd climbed to the attic. The old staircase bowed under age, creaked beneath his heavy steps. The attic corners were thick with dust, cobwebs strung across rusted nails. The small wooden trunk was still there, latched tight with a length of frayed rope, knotted the way soldiers knot things. He undid the rope, opened the lid. The smell of old paper, mildew, and cedar oil rose like memory. Inside, a bundle of documents wrapped in coarse cloth, its stitching rotted to threads. The first page bore the deed to his wife's land, a red seal, a signature, a hand-drawn map with every boundary marked in blue ink, tree by tree. Silas held it in silence for a long time. A shaft of light pierced the rafters, slanting across his shoulder, casting a trembling shadow over the paper, but his hands stayed steady. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Mira stood there. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She looked at him, then at the paper in his hand, as if she understood. Silas offered no explanation. He simply folded the file, tucked it into his outer pocket, then turned and descended, each step drawn from some deep place in him, the place where he'd buried all the things he thought he could never return to. At the bottom stair he paused. Mira stood still behind him. She didn't ask, "What was in that paper?" Didn't say, "I'm not worth this." She only placed her large, calloused hand on his shoulder and left it there, not gripping, not trembling. And in that moment, the two of them, one who had lost a wife and one who had once been chained, seemed to know not everything lost is beyond redemption. That evening the sky hung low with clouds, not raining, just waiting. Twilight light fell over the dry fields like a breath cut short. Mira lit the stove early. In the pot simmered Silas's favorite, pumpkin stew with bone broth, not because anyone had asked for it, but because she remembered he once mentioned it. Silas was patching the saddle again. His hands moved slowly but evenly, like a ritual meant to keep his thoughts from straying towards what hadn't yet arrived. The front door sat ajar. A breeze whispered through, and then a knock. Not urgent, not hesitant, just small, as if the one knocking wasn't sure they had the right. Mira answered. There stood a boy, soaked from rain, hair matted in clumps, feet caked in dry mud, pants torn to the knee. No bag, no paper, no name stitched to his collar. Only eyes, wide, tired, and far too quiet for his age. He didn't say please, didn't cry, just stood there like a leaf fallen out of season, blown off course, unsure where he was allowed to stop. Mira looked at him. Not with pity, not with judgment, just looked, as if recognizing something, a part of herself that once stood in the same place. Wet, hungry, with nothing left to explain. No questions were asked. She turned inside, took a spoon, the smallest in the basket, and laid it on the table. No words passed. Silas gave a quiet nod, then added more water to the stew, adjusted the salt. The boy remained at the door, not stepping in. But when Mira returned, she knelt down, removed his muddy shoes, wiped his feet with the cloth used for firewood, then motioned him forward. He entered slowly, each step asking, "Am I really allowed to be here?" 3 people, 3 spoons. The oil lamp threw shadows on the wall, one large, one medium, one small. Not the same, but side by side. They ate in silence. Mira didn't stare, didn't ask where he was from or about his parents. She simply split a piece of cornbread from her plate, placed half a little closer to his hand. When he finished, she didn't ask, "Is that enough?" She stood, fetched a blanket, spread it on the corner bench near the fireplace, and disappeared into the back room. The boy lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling, as if still unable to believe someone would let him stay. And in the space between 2 gusts of wind, the rustling outside seemed to pause, just long enough to hear it clearly, the sound of a small spoon touching the bottom of a bowl. The first few days the boy said nothing. He ate quietly, slept soundly, never asked, never told, as if he'd long accepted he was merely passing through other people's lives. Mira didn't ask his name, Silas even less so. All he said was, "If the boy's still here by morning, we'll dig another trench out back. Dry season's coming, the wind'll crack the soil." The next morning, the boy was still there, eyes open, curled under an old blanket, his head resting on the straw pillow Silas's wife once kept for the old dog. Long gone now, but the pillow was still soft. Mira handed him a small bowl, a few slices of dried cornbread and a trickle of honey water inside. He took it, didn't speak, but his hands shook less. That afternoon, Silas brought out a small hoe, short-handled, the kind he used to teach the neighbor kids how to dig up potatoes. He didn't hand it to the boy, just set it near where the child sat, then walked off to water the barley as if it weren't meant for anyone in particular. The boy stared at the tool for a long time, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to hold it. Then slowly, he wrapped both hands around the wooden grip. No cheers, no applause. But from inside the kitchen, Mira quietly placed a glass of water on the windowsill. For someone just beginning, day by day he followed Silas to the barn, learned how to herd goats, pull weeds, count eggs. Still, he hadn't said his name, but Silas started calling him Toby. No one corrected it, and from then on he was Toby. One summer evening the wind had stilled. Silas was mending rope. Mira was trimming dry roots from the beans. Toby was chasing a young goat, the gray and white one with legs longer than scents, wild as a spring breeze. He tripped, fell head first into a pile of straw, his hair covered in goat fuzz and dust. The goat skipped off, hooves tapping against the water trough, and then it came, a laugh. Not loud, not echoing, just a small laugh, like something accidentally escaping from a chest that had stayed shut too long. It made Mira stop what she was doing, made Silas lift his head. No one said a word, but a sudden gust swept through the yard, tossing golden dust across the porch, casting the last light of day all the way inside. Silas turned to Mira. "Rain's coming," he said. She didn't answer, just rolled down her sleeves and looked toward Toby, who was brushing straw from his hair, still quietly laughing with the goat. The rain didn't fall that night, but in the hearts of the three of them, something had already begun to grow. That morning the sky bore no sun and no clouds, just a thin strip of mist clinging to the mountains, like the sagging back of an old horse too tired to run. Silas was shaving corn from the cob. Mira spread dry beans across a burlap cloth. Toby sat in the yard's corner drawing lines in the dirt with a brick, making paths for the wandering chickens. Then came the sound of hooves. Not one, 3. And this time it wasn't some dusty wooden cart. It was a black wagon, paint still shining, with marshal's office carved into the side, in accordance with Texas state law, 1892. Silas set the knife down. Mira stood. She didn't retreat. She simply pulled a scarf over her hair and folded her hands behind her back, like someone waiting for a question they're never sure they'll be allowed to answer. 3 men stepped down. The first, Amos Reed, Mound Creek Reformatory's overseer, hair slicked back, eyes sharp as a razor, the same man who had ordered Mira chained 2 summers ago. The second, a new lawyer, crisp suit, steel-rimmed glasses. The third, the sheriff, older, his face firm but not cruel. The lawyer spoke first. "We have a formal order under Texas Reformatory Code to reclaim lost property, subject Mira G, Class 2, deemed unstable, under supervision of Mound Creek Facility, directed by Mr. Amos Reed." Amos smirked. His eyes swept across Mira like she was a dented piece of freight. Silas opened the pocket of his coat, pulled out a folded bundle of papers, yellowed, frayed along the edges. He didn't hold them out, just walked slowly over and laid them atop the water barrel. "These are my wife's land deeds," he said, "before they were falsified, with Amos Reed's signature on the wrong page, official seal, original map. If you've got authority, then read it. If not, go home." The sheriff picked up the file, squinting. He flipped page by page. When he reached the map, he straightened, looked out over the land, the goat pen, the line of cactus, the old oak. Then he looked at Mira, still standing tall, her gaze unwavering. Toby hid behind her, but seeing she didn't flinch, he stepped forward and took the hem of her dress. The lawyer frowned and whispered to the sheriff, but the sheriff shook his head. "This file's in order," he said, "and there's no proof she remains under institutional custody. If Amos wants to sue, let him take it to court." Amos scoffed. "So we came all this way just to hear this old man cry over the past?" The sheriff didn't answer. He simply closed the file, handed it back to Silas, with both hands. "May the dry season be kind to you, sir." They climbed into the wagon and rode off, dust rising in a cloud thick enough to swallow the trail. Amos looked back once, eyes bitter, but said nothing more. That evening not much was said. Toby collected stones and rebuilt the small garden fence. Mira lit the stove early. Silas cleaned his wife's old shoes, the ones Mira still wore. But this time he didn't tie the laces. He left them loose, so the one wearing them could choose, stay, or go. In the last light of day, 3 shadows cast long upon the wooden wall. One tall, one small, one stooped. No one needed to hide. No one had to prove they had the right to stay. A week after the letter had been sent, the western wind shifted. It carried the smell of scorched fields and rotting roots, signs the weather was turning and that something from the past was circling back. June lit the stove under the hearth, her hands wrapped in finger-worn wool gloves. Elijah checked the rope lines, his eyes scanning the tree line. The same place he'd once seen his daughter, hair bright as wheat, riding hard, waving from afar, her laughter still lodged somewhere in his ribs like a sliver of bone. He'd never told anyone that memory, but it stayed sharp, like a blade kept in the dark just in case. That night the sound came, not a wolf, not wind, hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, the kind of rhythm a rider makes when he knows he'll be noticed. The gate was still unbarred. Elijah didn't lock it with metal, only with his gaze. The man came into view under a jagged moon, beard like tangled rope, eyes red and twitching like a cornered coyote. Abel Rook, the one who left June beneath the pine with a scribbled note, who let the wind carry off his fatherhood like it was loose paper. Now he was back, not for penance, but for a debt unpaid. He slid from his horse, didn't tie the reins, bottle of half-drunken liquor swinging in one hand. His voice was gravel, but not loud. "June, I know you're there. Come out. I need you." June trembled. Her hand clenched the gun in her coat, the only truth she could hold. Elijah laid a hand on the inner latch. The house was silent like an old man waiting for the wild thing to pass. Abel's voice cracked. "I need you so they'll let me go. They think I still got you. If not, I'm done." He gripped the fence, eyes down. For a moment his voice fell soft, not to her, but maybe to himself. "I didn't want to leave you that day. I just didn't know how to be a father. Never did." June stepped from the side of the house, holding an oil lantern. Its golden glow lit her face, thinner but no longer shrinking. Elijah started to stop her, but his hand froze at the frame. She stood in the yard, under shadow, not raising the gun. Only the light, eyes met, wind rustled the pine, a whisper from the dead. Abel faltered. Maybe it was the light. Maybe because the girl before him wasn't the same one he'd abandoned. "Come with me, June. You're my blood." She shook her head, didn't speak. He looked around, expecting someone to step in, but all that stood was the fence, the rope, and the pole carved with words. "June stays here." He turned his horse, gripped the reins. His eyes lingered, not with anger, but like a man who just lost something he'd never known how to hold. The hoofbeats faded, not like victory, but like regret limping away under moonlight. Elijah came out, stood beside June. Neither spoke. The wind stirred dust, but this time no one felt cold. June remained long after the sound was gone. The oil lamp flickered in her hand, its light trembling in the breeze, like a heart reignited after a long, dark season. Elijah didn't say a word. He only placed a hand on her shoulder, light as a pine bough on a tired child's frame. They didn't speak of what had just passed, because sometimes silence is the only way to preserve the dignity of someone who's just begun to earn it. She stepped inside the cabin, still holding the lamp. Did not cry. Elijah closed the door, bolted it, not out of fear, but because someone now inside deserved to sleep in peace. The next morning the sky cleared. The wind turned strangely warm, as if the earth itself understood. Something had been laid down and no one needed to pick it back up. June went to the stable early, her hands clumsy as she fastened the saddle. Elijah watched her through a crack in the door. There was something in the way she stood, no longer a child abandoned, but someone choosing where she belonged. That morning they ate cornbread. June poured tea for Elijah, her hand steadier than before. He took a sip, nodded once. She asked, "Do you think he'll come back?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He sliced off a piece of bread, handed it to her, then said, "I don't know. But some men only return when they think they still own what they left behind. Yesterday, you didn't let him think that." June nodded, didn't speak, but she knew. In that nod was a farewell to the version of herself that had once been passed from hand to hand like something with a price. That afternoon, June took the revolver from her coat and laid it back on the kitchen table. She cleaned it with her sleeve and said, "I don't need to carry this anymore. Not because nothing will happen, but because now I know I won't be treated like I don't matter." Elijah looked at the gun, then at her, nodded. "No one's keeping you here, but you stayed by choice." She bowed her head, not in gratitude, but like a promise, that here she didn't have to run. That evening it began to rain. Elijah sat by the window watching the pines sway on the porch. June sat by the fire, mending the seam of her old coat. No one asked, "What are we to each other now?" They didn't have to. The girl who was once a thing to be exchanged was now someone worth keeping, for no reason but kindness. The old soldier who once brewed tea for ghosts no longer poured for someone who wouldn't return. There were two sources of warmth in the wooden cabin that night, one from the fire and one from the kind of peace that finally had a name.